you have been following to any degree yesterday's conversations, I do not introduce the speakers. I leave it to you to introduce yourself. You have 10 minutes to give a lay of the land. I have no particular preference, so if it's all the same with you, Clark, Helena, why don't you take the floor, and Clark, you can follow. And it's so good to see the both of you. Thanks for joining.
It's great to see you too, Sanjana, and thank you for having us here. It's dark here because I'm calling from London. My name is Helena. I'm the director of Buildup, which is a nonprofit that works in peacebuilding in the digital age. And I'm also not going to give myself much of an introduction because, as Sanj said, there's been lots of information shared about us and about our work. You know, when Sanjana invited me to speak at this event, I always like speaking at events that he curates because he always asks the best questions. And he sent me lots of very difficult questions, and I'm only going to answer one. Sorry about that. But I'm going to try and do it well, and then you can ask me other questions. One of the questions that Sanj asked is, I'm paraphrasing, but it went something like, if algorithms amplify toxicity, then how do we best combat harm and hate at scale? So it's not a small question, and I know lots of people yesterday and now this morning began to talk about that, but I want to come at this question from maybe just a different perspective that I think can also elucidate a different kind of reflection that builds on what you've been already talking about, which is really the perspective of peace building, which is my professional background. And I think, you know, what I want to do is just talk a little bit about how I would come at this question, and through that bring out a couple of things that we've been doing at Buildup, but really just give a lay of the land. I think because I work in peace building, I understand social media as I would any other context, any other socio-technical context, any other conflict context. And certainly, in particular with social media, a context where conflict is evidently rife. You know, you've talked about, Sanjana, and the previous speakers have talked about hate, incitement. I would also speak about othering and the breaking of social fabric and of social cohesion that goes with othering, and the types of identity formation that go with othering. And the reason I kind of come at social media in this way in particular, and at the online environment in general, as if it were a conflict context, is because when you work in peace building, when you try to work in peace building, one of the first things that you learn is that if you're going to work in peace building, if you're going to try to broker dialogues, to bring people together, to bridge divides, you really need to go into the psychology of conflict. For me, when I was starting in this field, one of the turning points was reading a book that I would really recommend by somebody called James Hillman. He's a psychologist, and he wrote a book called A Terrible Love of War. And in A Terrible Love of War, what James Hillman talks about is that we really need to get into the imagination of war to understand how we might build peace. And for me, it was a huge intellectual turning point, because I really took it to heart. I thought, you know, that's how we need to approach any of the work that we do, and when we're trying to bridge divides in society. And that includes the kinds of divides that there are on social media. So what I want to talk about is a little bit how I try to go into the psychology of war, or the psychology of conflict, or the psychology of divide when I look at social media. And I want to come at it in a way through the kinds of activities that peace builders do. So I'm going to try and, it's the first time I do this, Sanjana, so look at what you've done to me. So I'm going to try to go through you know, the kinds of actions that people working in a conflict context would take, and how they have a parallel on social media that I think is quite illuminating, at least for me. So, you know, one of the first things that happens when anybody working in peace building goes into a conflict environment is that we look to stop what is the most evident violence, right? The most evident physical violence. And this is often through the brokering of ceasefires. And for me, when I look at social media and some of the activities that are happening on social media, it's not unlike trying to broker a ceasefire. So when we look at content moderation or at deplatforming certain people, what we're doing is we're trying to stop the most evident violence that is happening on social media. But one of the challenges with ceasefires in an offline environment is that what you're doing is you're burying the signals of what is a much deeper societal conflict, right? So of course, ceasefires are necessary. Of course, content moderation and deplatforming people are necessary. But they're also, in some ways, burying the signals of a conflict that is very evident. So as peace builders, we always move a level down, right? We say, okay, fine, the ceasefire has kind of, stop things as they are, but we need to go a level deeper. This is not where conflict transformation is going to happen. And so typically in an offline environment, what then happens is you start looking at what are the rules of engagement, right? So you say, okay, ceasefires are, they will always get broken. So what are the rules of engagement in this conflict environment? And how can we create rules of engagement where violence only happens in certain permitted ways? And I think for me, a lot of the kind of the rules of engagement on platforms are not unlike these rules of engagement in conflict settings as well. But the other things that happens at this moment in a conflict transformation process is there start to be typically a lot of peace education programs, right? So these are like big messaging programs that sort of say, here's how you should approach the narrative of war. And for me, this is not unlike a lot of the work that I've seen on social media that looks at digital literacy programs. So, hey, listen, we know all of this is happening, all of this incitement is happening on social media, but here's how to approach content that you're seeing. Here's how to understand what is disinformation. Here's how to not fall for fake news or for rumors, right? And this work is very important at this point in a conflict transformation process, right? You have rules of engagement, you have kind of education on how to reinterpret a narrative, and it's very similar on social media. But at some point, even if you are trying to adopt a peace narrative, even if on social media you are trying to behave in ways that you know are responsible, you're still being poisoned by the toxicity around you. This happens in offline environments, and it happens on social media. Even if I want to approach my social media feeds with the eyes of a peace builder, I can still get triggered because ultimately I'm still being manipulated. And so in traditional peace building, you then go a level deeper, right? You then say, look, this isn't just about rules of engagement and about peace education. It's not just about whether we have ethical rules on a platform and whether we educate people about digital literacy. This is really about the structures that are undergirding this conflict. In an offline conflict, the structures that undergird a conflict are typically economic structures. And I have, over time, begun to understand the structures that undergird the conflicts that we see on social media in a similar way, in the sense that a lot of the social media platforms are operating on a surveillance capitalist model, which needs certain kinds of algorithms and certain kinds of nudges in order to optimize for profit. And those are creating the structures that are increasing polarizing behaviors and that are increasing the kind of manipulation and toxicity that we're seeing on social media. So what do we do as peace builders offline? Offline, what we do is we look at the structures, at the economic structures that are furthering a conflict. We look at the social structures that are furthering a conflict, and we try to create alternative structures. We try to create alternative spaces where behaviors can begin to shift. And the kinds of behaviors that we look at are behaviors like othering, are behaviors like the hegemony of power that is creating narratives. This is what we try to shift. It's these behaviors that we try to shift, right? And ultimately, behind this work, the question that we have is a question that you and I can ask ourselves, which is, why is this happening to us? It's not why is there conflict out there, is why is this happening to me, right? And this is beginning to go into this idea of the psychology of war. I think one of the things that as a peace builder I see on social media that perhaps is slightly different from other approaches is that I really try to see why is this happening to me and why is this happening to us? So not why is misinformation out there, but why am I attracted to misinformation? Why are we all attracted to misinformation? Why do things in fact go viral? Why do you think people, in fact, not leave social media platforms? Why haven't we all left Facebook or Twitter, knowing that it is toxic, right? And this is the kind of the to just speak very briefly about the work that Buildup does. This is a lot of the space in which we operate. So we organize essentially interventions on social media that find conversations through different ways that are showing signs of polarization. So I'm not talking about hate speech, I'm talking about what surrounds hate speech, if you like, and engages the people who are in these polarized conversations in what we hope is a more constructive dialogue, in a dialogue that points out that perhaps there is another hegemony, there is another narrative, that there is a way to talk that does not necessarily other, that there is something else that we can build online. Do I have time for something else, Sandra? Would you like me to stop there?
Maybe we stop there. Yeah, but why don't we pause there, and there's always space to reflect later on. Clark?
Hi, Sanjana.
Hey.
Hi, everyone else. Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to do a very quick intro to Moonshot, a very quick one. I'll get straight to my kind of opening remarks. So Moonshot, for those who don't know, has the ambitious goal, hence Moonshot, of ending online harms. Everything we do is in service to this goal. And what this really means day to day is that we do social media and platform monitoring to understand how harm proliferates in different online spaces. We run digital campaigns designed to pull people away from harm, offer them alternatives, and we run capacity building both online and when we can on the ground all over the world. As a quick way of bringing some of our work to life, Mr. Ash mentioned earlier the interstitials that appear when you search for keywords related to suicide. He mentioned there are similar initiatives around violent extremism. He's absolutely right. We built that methodology back in 2016 with the support of Jigsaw. It's called the redirect method. And our work has expanded a lot since then, but the same basic premise that you can intervene in an otherwise harmful journey and help that person still powers a lot of what we do. And I'll give some examples of it later on. So the way I've approached this introduction is to give quite a personal and direct answer to the question posed, which, as luck would have it, is exactly the same bit of the question that Helena chose, how best to combat harm and hate at scale. But also by drawing on my work at Moonshot, of course. So as a warning, don't take everything I'm saying as the viewpoint of all my colleagues. We're a beautifully diverse bunch of people, and I wouldn't want you to think I'm talking for all of them. So with that said, over the last 3 years at Moonshot, I've been trying to understand, and in some cases counter, a whole range of different phenomena that fall under the wider umbrella of online harms. And that's things like how gendered jihadist messaging works online, how the violent far right build narratives by curating real news stories in their channels, the way ultranationalism manifests on social media, how the internet is used to both facilitate and offer a way out of violent misogyny, how harmful conspiracy theories cross-pollinate, why media literacy is not a cure for disinformation, as Helena was saying, how comfortable people are sending public death threats to public figures, and the different ways people on different platforms use hate speech. And with all of that stuff behind me, reading the phrase, how best to combat harm and hate at scale, and also because I know Sanjana will want provocative rather than bland statements, I'm going to say the problem is not harm or hate by themselves, the problem is scale. And I'm going to try and argue that point. So there will always be dark corners of the internet, just exactly the same way there are streets that you're always going to avoid. There will always be message boards and platforms and whole sections of the internet that you will always avoid, and that if you visited them would put you at risk of harm. We spend a lot of time in both mainstream and niche online spaces, and if I can give my personal view here, the mainstream frightens me way more than the niche, simply really by virtue of the numbers. The extent to which it's possible to cause harm, whether through widespread manipulation of people's opinions, bullying, harassment, death threats, or organized pile-ons that destroy someone's career and their mental health, the extent to which it's possible to do those things is directly related to the number of users on a platform. And of course, violent right-wing Telegram channels and anarchic image boards and incel forums need to be understood. And in the cases where they're inciting violence or suicidal ideation, they need to be actively monitored and reported. But users on a platform that doesn't contain the mechanics for virality can only do so much harm at scale. So if we want to talk about combating harm and hate at scale, I would start with the biggest mainstream platforms. I'm going to torture a metaphor. I realize people have used it many, many times before, but it doesn't make it any less true that we're living through the Wild West of the internet. In Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Amazon, and the rest, we have a new kind of critical infrastructure. Not unlike the railroads and the telephone lines of the mid 1800s. Whether we like it or not, people are already dependent on this infrastructure, many of us for work. Businesses live and die by whether they're discoverable on Google, are listed on Amazon, or if they can reach their customers on Twitter. And all of this happened before we figured out how to make them safe. So worn out though it is, I think the analogy of the Wild West still stands, not because the internet is lawless, because reality, as we know, is a lot more complicated than that, but because we've become rapidly dependent on this new critical infrastructure, which has in many ways transformed the world for better, but we've done it before we figured out how to make it safe. Now, whether giant tech companies are precisely analogous to critical infrastructure, or as others have argued, public spaces and public parks, I don't think any of the analogies are perfect, but I think they're useful. It doesn't matter that they're not perfect. They're useful to try and emphasize because they can make what feels like an intangible, intractable problem feel a little bit more tangible and solvable. And to see what I mean, if we look at some actual critical infrastructure and public spaces and some assumptions that we make about them, or that we take for granted, nobody complains that the kids' play area in your park has a spongy floor, or that there's no broken glass, or that motorways have crash barriers, or that 87% of countries worldwide mandate that we use seatbelts in cars. The Postal Service is not allowed to open our mail, read our letters, and then send us adverts based on what we wrote in our letters. In my hometown of Manchester, the gap between the fixed public benches is just slightly narrower than a transit van, so that no one can drive into the space and run people over. No one complains about these things. Public spaces and critical infrastructure contain design choices put there, often by regulation, to protect us. And it's a process, it's a journey. Car manufacturers were furious about seatbelts, but now we won't set off without them, not because it's not legal, but because it's safer to use them. We're beginning to see huge tech companies try similar ideas. Twitter, as you may have noticed, now suggests that you read an article before retweeting it, although it doesn't, it still lets you retweet it, but it gets in the way. Facebook have tried a variety of things. They're not very public about what worked and what didn't, but for example, they tried sending you a private notification if you posted a known piece of misinformation about COVID. And we take it completely for granted, but all mainstream platforms regularly remove huge amounts of harmful content. Now, we all know it's not enough. It's not happening quickly enough. We see this every single day. And of course, by building and profiting from unregulated critical infrastructure, they have facilitated widespread harm. But nonetheless, I feel like, it's something I touched on this earlier, the sort of the paucity of debate around this, it's inexorable that our big digital public spaces will, eventually be similar in their protections to our physical public spaces. And that brings us, I think, to two big questions that I want to highlight. The first one is about who drives that change. Either the platforms get ahead of it and they fix it themselves, or they will be regulated into shape. I think it is as simple as that. And on that debate, essential though it is, I'm a spectator. The other question is the one I'm professionally interested and involved in, which is what do we do in the meantime? While those debates rage on, what are we doing about the people using these platforms, both to move towards harm and express their desire to escape it? One upside of it being the Wild West is that the same techniques available to those who would do harm online are available to those of us who are trying to reduce it. And in this sense, organizations like Buildup and Moonshot are in some ways playing in a space that shouldn't really exist. At Moonshot, a lot of what we do comes down to reaching people at risk of harm and offering them an alternative path, some sort of way out. And in doing so, we are effectively supplying the guardrails that should be, and in my opinion, hopefully one day will be, an inherent part of these platforms' infrastructure. I said I'd give some examples of the things we kind of find out. And it is true that sometimes in supplying these guardrails ourselves, we sometimes discover really fascinating things that have implications, not just for our ability to combat harm and hate at scale, but for how those platforms should also be doing it. So to bring that to life, I'll just give a couple of examples and then I'll hand back. For example, you can use commercially available tools to reach an audience of people defined not by their age, their ethnic background, or their religious beliefs or anything else, but purely by what they're looking for online. You can reach them with narratives that deliberately seek to undermine the harmful narrative they were searching for. Or if they're searching for known pieces of disinformation, you can reach them with evidence to the contrary or tools to teach them critical thinking. Or maybe they're searching for neo-Nazi death metal. Well, then you can send them to death metal that has nothing to do with Nazism. You can test the effectiveness of different types of content too. You can test whether a comedy sketch about joining ISIS is watched more by people who are actually trying to join ISIS than something else. You can see if people are trying to join other violent extremist groups. So they're typing in how to join the 3%ers around January 6th. You can see if they'll engage with mindfulness and well-being content, or maybe just a bubble that says breathe in, breathe out. And we found that they would, significantly more so than other much more narrative-based content. You can even do something like running a hyper locally tailored campaign that shows people searching for really high-risk terms where their local park is and tells them to just go for a walk. And you can also connect them to offline support services, to real-world counseling and intervention providers. And in many cases, they will take the chance and they will use them. We've done all of these things and more, and we will keep doing it, because until our digital public spaces undergo major reform, combating hate and harm at scale surely requires us to experiment and to innovate and to connect people with information and services that can support instead of harm them. And we need to do this at pace and at the same massive scale.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll leave it there for now and hand it back.
Yeah, thanks, Clark. I'm just going to immediately open it up for questions. And I just wonder, I mean, I don't want to ask the two of you to reflect on this, but it is something that I've been talking about with some of the people in the room. Does all of this work over instant messaging? It assumes that what is observable and what is possible to respond to is also possible to harvest for research purposes or for regulatory purposes as well. What happens with encrypted messaging, which is absolutely critical to activism and advocacy, but of course, a point of contention for regulatory oversight and legal frameworks around the world, which seek to quote unquote backdoors into it, sometimes for the best of intent, but of course it provides a template for authoritarianism and autocracy to adapt and adopt for their purposes as well. So that's, I'm sure, something that Helena and Clark are also thinking about as we move forward. But